Okay, the gig economy, the gig sharing and peer-to-peer economy, policy, considerations, and constraints. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Royse. I'm the founder of the Royse Law Firm. I also run this webinar series, and this is the first in a series on the new economy. Today's webinar is going to be on the policy considerations, legal aspects, high-level sort of issues that we have to confront as we approach this new economy and this new and developing economy. So a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you are tweeting, you should tweet to hashtag Royse University. You can also follow us on Twitter at Royse University. This webinar is being recorded. You will be able to find it later, post it to the Royse University website. It'll also be on the Royse Law YouTube site and available for download as a podcast in the iTunes store. During the webinar, we have several excellent speakers. If you have questions, if you're using the mobile app, you'll see down at the bottom of the app, there's a dialog box for questions. Just click on that question mark if you'd like to submit a question to us. If you're on your computer, in the right-hand side of your screen, towards the bottom, you'll see a little arrow that says questions. Go ahead and click on that and ask us a question. We'll gather them and try to get to them towards the end of our discussion. So before I introduce the speakers, I want to give you a little bit of background on why we are doing this series and why the gig economy is so important to us. And those terms, gig economy, sharing economy, peer-to-peer, it's a little bit elusive to people. In fact, the Department of Commerce has just replaced all of it with its own term, digital matching firms, meaning that a company that uses information technology like a mobile app to facilitate peer-to-peer transactions. It offers its workers a digital matching platform and some flexibility in choosing their hours. And it relies on workers to use their own tools or assets to provide a service. I think that's what's creating a lot of the problems as we try to figure out, how to classify these companies and how to regulate them. However, according to one study, 72% of all Americans have now used some type of shared or on-demand online service, even though hardly anybody, only about 10% of the people know what we're talking about when we say gig economy. Transactions in 2015, depending on who you ask, is $10 billion to $15 billion. Pricewaterhouse reports at $15 billion. It's expected to be at least that big in 2016, and the Pricewaterhouse report expects it to be a $335 billion business by 2025. So I think we're all expecting a huge amount of growth in this area. And even now, the gig economy companies are rivaling some of the biggest companies in the country. Uber is valued at $62 billion. Lyft is valued at $5 billion. Just raised $1 billion from its investors this year. Just to give you a sense of perspective, Honda and Ford are both valued at around $60 billion. Airbnb is around $25 billion. And again, to give you some perspective, the entire Hilton hotel chain has a valuation of about $25 billion. So it gives you an idea of how much people are valuing these companies that have no brick and mortar. So a few other statistics that are worth noting here like I say, 72%, according to a JP Morgan study of U.S. persons have used the service. However, only about 1% of U.S. adults have earned income on the platform in any given month. You can see that there's a lot of room for growth. There's still a lot of people who are not yet using it, even though it's grown quite a bit. And just from my own perspective, I think the Great Recession and this very slow recovery that we've had has been incentivizing people to look to the gig economy to supplement their income. I think that's been contributing to the rise. I think the fact that the technology has gotten so good now, and it's made it so easy to use, and it's given us all confidence in the security of the payments, and we also have review systems in place that make these sort of services much more reliable, has helped with the rise. And just media and social acceptance and cultural acceptance. I mean, 5 years ago, I never would have believed that I would, just ask some stranger to come pick me up and give me a ride across town. But of course, now we know that's how a lot of, that's how 72 million people get across town these days. So the other big trends that I want to hit on, and I'll let our panelists talk more about it, that I've noticed as a lawyer in this is one of those industries where, unlike traditional industries where you have to make this huge capital investment before you can do business, there's hardly any capital investment involved in a gig economy business. You just set up a website, which are not that hard to build these days, Web 2.0 or beyond. So it's pretty low cost to get into. And as a result, I'm seeing this phenomenon in this space that we're also seeing in cannabis, for that matter, where companies just do it and take risky positions and ask for forgiveness later, rather than going and getting regulatory approvals ahead of time. And I think that has profound policy implications as well as to the way the legislatures and the regulators will address this. I've noticed that this has been setting itself up, this whole area, as an area, sometimes a political issue, sometimes certainly an issue that can be contentious. For example, last summer, you may recall that Jeb Bush, when he was running for president, published a long-form post on LinkedIn about the sharing economy and how much he supports it. At the same time, Hillary Clinton also made a speech about the sharing economy and her belief that it needed to be more protective towards workers' rights. So this issue has worked its way into the political landscape as well. And certainly across the country, you see lots of lobbying and lots of PR among consumer groups who will weigh in on legislation, privacy groups who objected to some proposals that would have gathered data on people's usage of some of these apps, especially the Uber apps or the Lyft apps. And this really, now we have set up a battle between the old economy and traditional protectionism, which tends to regulate sometimes to favor the regulated, and the new economy, which seems to be much more consumer oriented. Now, the last thing that I want to say about this is that, why are we talking about this? I mean, even though it's very interesting, this has real world consequences for our clients and our companies. Because even though these companies like Lyft and Uber and Airbnb have humongous valuations and are raising tons of money, that's going down. In fact, in 2016, by my count, only 76 startups in this space received outside funding. I think there's definitely been a cooling of capital investment. And I can only tell you anecdotally that I think it is because of what has been going on in the legal landscape. There have been some very widely publicized lawsuits around especially the independent contractor versus employee issues. And there's been some widely publicized failure. I mean, Homejoy comes to mind around these issues and these lawsuits. And so there is definitely a need for us all to get on the same page as a policy matter. And we certainly are not, is what I would say. I note just in reading up on this material for today that there was a very big convening of people in San Francisco recently to talk about gig economy issues, and part of the dialogue had to do with, part of the dialogue was how do we enable this new and exciting economy, but another part of the dialogue was, well, gee, how are we going to spread the wealth? How are we going to harness the technology so that those bad venture capitalists don't get it all, and that we can spread it among all the people who are progressive and green and utopian, etc. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion here, and there's certainly a lot of different directions that this could go in the future. So now, our panelists, briefly, I'd like to just give you an outline of who we have today, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to offer a few comments. George Yang is the CEO at etacard.com. They are a business that provides mobile transportation solutions to tourists, seniors, and residents He's also the sustainability advisor to the Silicon Valley International Groups. He has a lot of experience in international business and transaction, and has also been very active in social and political causes. He's been a candidate for office several times, most recently for California U.S. Senate. Justin Erlich is a Special Assistant Attorney General to California Attorney General Kamala Harris. He's the Principal Advisor on Technology and Data. He oversees the Department of Justice's involvement in policy issues such as open data, privacy, cybersecurity, the sharing economy, and clean tech. And he is driving multiple operational initiatives in the office, including Open Justice, which is a digital engagement strategy, an internal research group, an innovation office, and the Cyber Accelerator. Justin previously was a manager at McKinsey & Company, and he also clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Barquette in the Court of Appeals of the 11th Circuit. And he got his JD from my old school, NYU. So we're very happy to have Justin here. And then finally, Professor Michael Munger is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics and Public Policy at Duke University. He is a PhD in economics from Washington University in St. Louis. He's worked as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission and taught economics at Dartmouth and University of Texas at Austin and North Carolina at Chapel Hill before going to Duke. Michael also is the author of several books, most recently one called Choosing in Groups, and another, The Thing Itself, both published last year. And he researches and writes quite prolifically on the study of the morality of exchange and the working of the new middleman economy, which I think is very related to what we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to turn this over, first of all, to George to say a few words. So George, if you're there.
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, first of all, a small introduction. The company that I ran is for Chinese tourists, and actually I'm also working with another one that's kind of like Airbnb, but also targeted to Chinese and Asian tourists. And one of the issues that today a couple of issues I want to talk about is the legal barrier of entry for small businesses, especially in the terms of the fees and permits and insurance requirements. The second one is how the nature of the global market, and also from the perspective of a smaller startup, that's patent application adjudication in terms of time and also uncertainty. Those are things that if I have a chance today, I would like to talk about a little bit. I have been in the IT industry for about 20 years. I have a master's degree in telecommunications management from Golden Gate, and one of the things that Roger have talked about, which is very interesting, is like the regulation. And one thing that people should ask is that what are we regulating for? Who are we trying to protect? Are we trying to protect the consumers? Are we trying to protect workers? Are we trying to protect legacy businesses? Or, for example, in the PUC in California, are we protecting people who are underserved? In the old days, in the telephone marketplace, we have monopolies so that the phone company can spend those money they can make in the wealthier areas to serve underserved areas. Now, with this gig economy, this becomes a lot more touchier. For example, Uber and Lyft have both been under fire for not serving, underserved communities, and those are issues of whether or not the free market can solve those problems, or whether that legal issues and laws must be passed to do that. So those are issues that I think we probably can, it would be nice to have a discussion on those.
Okay, thank you, George. So Justin Erlich, the Special Assistant Attorney General, would you like to maybe say a few words to introduce yourself and how you come to the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thanks for having me, and thanks to all who are joining the webinar. So I am, as Roger said, the advisor to the Attorney General on all technology matters. And how that really manifests itself on some levels is that the Technological evolution is going at an incredibly rapid rate, and obviously law cannot evolve at the same pace as technology is. So a lot of my role is around thinking about the impact of emerging technologies on law and thinking how law shapes and impacts emerging technologies. So in that capacity, one of the things that we have been looking at a lot is with the innovation of these new startups exploring new business models and new approaches, how should we think about applying very decades-old law to these new types of behaviors? And Roger, as you mentioned, there are some dynamics that are making this particularly interesting, really surrounding the low barriers to entry and low capital needs to enter into this space of quote-unquote digital matching, means that many folks to seek forgiveness rather than permission, with the idea that the best strategy is to start building a core user base rather than try and go through the traditional regulatory approaches. And I think that is in part a function of the need to be quick to market is so vital in this space, particularly as what technology products are effective today may be different than 6 months from now. And also, we're a class of regulators who are still grappling with this changing landscape. And so I think we're sort of at a critical moment in our innovation versus regulation dialogue, where we really need to start exploring new, more agile ways of regulation that can both continue to ensure consumer protection and also make sure that we don't stifle good ideas. And so I think the coming months and years will really be defined by exploring new ways to balance both of those, so that it's not really a false choice, but actually a better dialogue where both parties are coming together at the table. We've been seeing in the field, but I think that's generally the lens that our office has been looking to take.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Munger, are you there? And would you like to say a few words?
I am here, and of course I'd like to say a few words. I'm a professor, so thank you to the organizers, and thanks to the listeners. I've been working on, and I've almost finished, a book called Tomorrow 3.0, and I'm comparing the revolution that we're undergoing now to the Industrial Revolution and the Neolithic Revolution. Now that's pretty grandiose, but it's interesting to think about the changes that have happened in the last 10 years and what they bode for our future as an economy and a political society. Seems to me there's three value propositions in what we're calling the gig economy, and they're quite different. And so unless you can read different things, it's actually hard to understand what's going on. The first is excess capacity. We have a bunch of stuff that we don't use very much. We have apartments, we have rooms, cars, bicycles, all sorts of things that are in storage, and we pay a lot for storing them. We store them in parking lots and garages, we store them in closets, and we could make better use of them. The second is our ability to sell reductions in transactions cost, and that's the matching part. It's difficult for us to find each other in order to take advantage of these reductions that these things we could sell for excess capacity. And transactions cost have three parts. There's the triangulation, we have to find each other. The transfer, we have to make the exchange and we have to pay the money in a way that's convenient. And the last is trust. We have to be able to trust each other. And if we can accomplish those three things, well, there's a bunch of bearded hipsters right now making pickles in Brooklyn and selling them all over Manhattan Island because it's easy to find them. There's no excess capacity there, but there are new products, new local products moving back to the sort of thing where in the 1940s and 1950s we had milk and other things delivered to our house. We might be able to go in that direction again if we can sell reductions in transactions cost. But the third value proposition is that a lot lot of these new companies are workarounds for what many people might say are restrictive regulatory policies or high taxes. And to some extent, that third one is a kind of piracy, because we have a lot of people who have in good faith worked to obey the rules, they've gotten the registration, they've paid their licenses, they've paid their taxes, and for somebody to say, well, consumers would be better off if we don't have to pay that. That's true, but we have to worry about the fact that in good faith, people have done what the government said they needed to do. So it's interesting to see that when you think about the companies that have actually succeeded, it's at the intersections of those three value propositions. So I have a car in a few minutes, you need a ride, we can find each other, and I can avoid the fact that I need to pay for a taxi medallion. That's Uber. So in a way, it's taking advantage of excess capacity. It's taking advantage of the reduction in transactions costs so we can trust each other, but it's also a way of working around taxes and licenses. And it's hard to know, we're kind of in the wild, wild west, it's hard to know how that's going to shake out. One of the most interesting companies that I think people in the US don't know it, but I encounter it often in Europe, is BlaBlaCar. If I'm giving a talk about this, I'll ask a young lady, ma'am, do you hitchhike? And she'll say, well, no, I would never hitchhike. Well, when you think about it, there's a bunch of trucks and cars that are traveling between cities. They have an extra seat or two. You need a ride. If you could have the density of transactions that would allow you to find a seat in a truck that was leaving when you wanted, was going where you wanted, and was safe, you would use it. Well, BlaBlaCar sells seats, sells excess capacity. It also sells reductions in transactions cost. And blah blah means you get to choose the level of conversation you want. Blah means you don't like to talk. Blah blah means, in their words, enjoys a natter. And blah 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 means you can't shut up. So you can find a truck going from where you are to where you want to go, when you want to go, and you can control the level of conversation. So that's the sort of thing, taking advantage of excess capacity, that means we can actually do a lot better job of working within the resource constraints we already have, rather than focusing on always making new stuff and throwing it away. So I think there's both there are exciting possibilities and some challenges that we need to work through.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I really like that blah blah idea. I think Uber should incorporate that for people like me who are not as social as the drivers usually are. So I want to circle back just into some of the things you were talking about and just the legal aspect of this, and then we'll go back to some of these economic issues. But let me kind of go right to the heart of this issue, and that's whether the law is really restricting or enabling innovation. And you mentioned that you have sort of a balancing act here in consumer protection versus in not stifling innovation. But you also, I think I heard you say that it's just really difficult for the law to evolve fast enough. I mean, can you give me some examples of, how the law, especially at the regulatory level, has changed or can change or is changing to enable some of these new technologies that are coming along, that especially like BlaBlaCar, which sounds like it could be very sustainable and green?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think laws that are written decades ago can never really foresee the types of behaviors that will happen in the future. So, as one very clear example of that, there's a law that's been on the books for decades that avoids fee splitting for people who give referrals to doctors, with the idea being that if you're getting an advice about what doctor to go see, it should be objective and no one should be profiting from it. So that law makes sense, and it's on its core about protecting consumer principles. But what happens in technology, in the technology era, when you have a ad or a posting of a coupon for a doctor that the poster gets some percentage of? Is that considered fee splitting? Even though it's not, it's just a technology platform that's not trying to point you in any one way, but it is a middleman in the technological marketplace that is getting some fee for connecting people. So I think there's issues like this that just start to complicate old standing laws, and oftentimes leave regulators wondering what's the best way to come down on an issue. I think in terms of how laws are evolving, if we actually look at who has been regulating the Ubers and Lyfts of the world in California, it has heretofore been the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, and they have been finding statutory or regulatory language stemming from stagecoaches and trans TNCs, these very old statutes that they are sort of modernizing themselves to apply to the current network. That being said, I think what we're also then seeing is realizing the shortcomings of some of those. So there's a lot of legal issues right now around, in the current regime, ride sharing with other passengers. We'd all agree that carpooling is probably on the whole great for the environment and should be encouraged, but the way laws are currently written is that it might actually be prevented. So at the same time as we try and breathe life or figure out questions about how to approach these existing laws, there's either new legislative bills being passed in Sacramento or new regulations being proposed by agencies like the PUC to make sure that we're modernizing our legal regime to accommodate for some of these new and better uses. But that said, on the other hand, regulators are falling on both sides of this. Some are trying to figure out new ways, some are trying to adopt existing, and some are looking to just shut down operations altogether. I think at one point Portland, Fort Lauderdale have both shut down Uber completely for violation of existing laws. So I think we're seeing a real spectrum of responses, and I think that's in part because it's sort of unclear what the best regulatory approach is when you have these new behaviors brushing up against existing law.
Yes, Roger, I just want to interject. I agree with Justin, and to the extent that we have a lot of hodgepodge of regulations in this country, whereas I want to do a comparison between here and China. China have a very, one regulation about taxis, and that's why Didi Chuxing, that's one of the company that just bought part of Uber, they are able to basically serve all the taxis in China, and they have 1 million transactions a day. Now, in this country, we have many cities having their individual regulations about taxi companies. And I talked to a lot of taxi companies. They would like to adopt the new technology, but they are under very stringent regulations about their fares, which means that the Uber model of trying to address your charge or cost based on real-time demand is not really possible. So some of those legacy laws and also pockets of regulation is really hurting American innovation.
Well, let me give you an example I read about in a paper just this morning, and I don't want to make this all about Uber, but there's such a good example. There was a bill in the legislature this year that would impose restrictions on just how Uber does background checks. And I don't know if it passed or not, but all I know is that it was, it was on the legislative agenda, and that to me, God, if somebody came into my business and told me if they micromanaged me, and I'm in a regulated industry, I'm a lawyer, but I don't think anybody regulates to that level of detail. That seems like there's a lot of burden there for a new entrant. If they have to learn the law to that extent to get into business. That's not a deal breaker, of course, but it is a cost. It is an additional cost. That one kind of struck me as going pretty far. On the other hand, I can certainly see the consumer protection requirements for having something like that, especially in view of some high-profile cases that have come up. But again, I want to come back to you, Professor Munger, because you had, you had cited, restrictive regulatory policy. But how do we, how do you even get around that when we're in a place where we've got rules that apply to stagecoaches that we are now trying to apply to, bus services, for example?
It's a terrible problem. One of the first concerns, I think, should be equal protection. You can't just pick and choose which companies you're going to apply this to. And so George is right. A lot of taxi companies face regulations that prevent them from changing, but we can't just say we'll waive it for Uber. It happens I was just in Austin, Texas, and Uber pulled out of Austin, Texas because there were requirements of background checks. Within 6 months, there's several other companies. The one that I used was Fare, F-A-R-E, and it's basically Uber. There's 3 or 4 Uber-like companies that now operate in Austin in the absence of Uber. And really all that was happening was that the Austin City Council wanted Uber to face the same background check regulations that taxi companies faced. So we do have to worry about equal protection. I think a lot of people on my side who are enthusiasts about the new economy just want to say, well, this is a way of subverting the system. We should worry about equal protection. But interestingly, here in North Carolina, there was a state statute that was passed to preempt any municipal ordinances that would regulate Uber like it was done in Austin, Texas. And this was done at the behest. This was a point that George brought up earlier. This was done at the behest of some very leftist legislators in the state Senate, led by Floyd McKissick from Durham, North Carolina. And his argument was, we have to have Uber everywhere because poor people cannot afford taxis. They're too expensive. So the benefit to poor people who can get to the doctor, who can get to the grocery store, is a really important part of this. We often worry, well, the profits are all going to venture capitalists. Maybe, but a lot of the benefits of having these products available go to poor people. And so Austin, by kicking Uber out, or by just to be fair, what Austin did was impose the same regulations on Uber that the taxi companies in Austin were already subject to. So Uber said, we're going to stand on the floor and kick our feet until we turn blue. Other companies come in. It's interesting to see whether companies from different areas are going to be able to solve this problem of negotiating taxes. And a number of places, and I think this is true in North Carolina also, Airbnb has started to pay local municipal taxes that hotels would be required to pay. It seems to me that's essential. You can't say the reason I'm going to use Airbnb is I don't have to pay hotel taxes. So this was a problem for a while for Amazon. Amazon wouldn't pay state sales taxes, and now they do, and that means that it's actually a more level playing field, at least on the tax and regulatory area. So I realize I'm jumping around, but the problem is I think this is a very confusing issue. It's easy to see that both sides have a good point.
Thank you, Professor. You know, I want to shift gears a little bit on that. I want to stick with you because the economic aspects of this are really fascinating to me. And, you know, so we've got another phenomenon going on the past 4 years, crowdfunding and crowdfinancing, and kind of the basis of the original bill introduced in the House was to apply the wisdom of the crowd to investing. Rather than letting a regulator decide what was good for the investor, we would let the crowd decide. Now, of course, that was the Jobs Act, which President Obama signed in 2011. It originated in a Republican House, and the Democratic Senate changed it. And what happened to that bill shouldn't happen to a dog. It went from an access to capital bill to another protection bill. But during that, one of the good things that came out of that was a lot of discussion about social capital and about the wisdom of the crowd and about democratizing the entire process. And regardless of where we end up, I think that was a really good discussion to start. And we're seeing that now in a lot of the sharing economy. There's a lot of these kind of benefits that we don't really measure in dollars. For example, I've read recently that the car sharing sites in some foreign countries have become a real social media. It's a way for people to meet people. You know, it's like, Tinder for cars or something. But there are other ancillary benefits here that are coming out of this new economy that we haven't even thought about, can't even conceive of or imagine. So we got to, I guess, weigh that against some of the social costs. Maybe it's exploiting labor, maybe we're subverting some consumer protection laws. But as an economist, Professor, any comments about some of the benefits of of a less regulated state and I guess a structure that encourages new ideas to get out into the market and have a chance.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is a sort of buzzword, but I think it's very important, and that's permissionless innovation. Permissionless innovation means that the state sets up an infrastructure and regulates its basic properties, but anybody who can connect onto it and can design something that benefits consumers, they can then do that in a way that's cheap enough. We're not really very good at measuring its value because we tend to take the number of units that are sold and multiply them by the price. But many things, Google, Facebook, Twitter, have a price of 0 at the point where someone's actually using it. Now, we're selling eyeballs in some cases to advertisers, but GDP, gross domestic product, is just not very good at measuring the value of these things. And in an economy, speaking as an economist, the value of things are the difference between what consumers would pay for it and what they have to pay for it. The technical term for that is consumer surplus. The consumer surplus of many of these new software platforms is so large it's almost unmeasurable. So the usual way that we think about things, that economies produce GDP and jobs. That's not actually what economies produce. What economies produce is human flourishing. So I think we're going to have to rethink how people can connect to permissionless innovation, and we have to have a new set of objectives for government policy. So as Justin said, we can't really blame the state for lagging behind because the regulators are obliged to enforce the law. They don't get to say, we're going to ignore the law. They have to enforce the law. But legislatures are having trouble keeping up with the pace of economic innovation. And we want to encourage permissionless innovation. It means that some mistakes are going to be made, but let me give an example of what happens when we don't. For a very long time, Bell Telephone would not allow people to connect their own equipment to the end of the lines that run to your house. You had to rent that from Bell Telephone. And so what we had was these big, heavy, frankly Soviet-looking telephones with rotary dials. And for years and years, they were always the same. As soon as Bell Telephone and AT&T were obliged to so it was deregulated just at that end, you could get your own equipment. A huge set of innovations was started. But as long as innovation required the permission of the owner of the network, you're going to hold innovation back. And you're not even going to know of the innovations that are foregone because they're unimaginable.
Yeah, for sure. I want to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask questions, you can go ahead and type your question in the dialog box in the lower right-hand side of your screen, or if you're on the mobile side, it's at the bottom. Just click on the question mark. And George, I promise I'm going to come back to you on this. I know you've got some things to say, but before we do, I do want to circle back on something Justin said about consumer protection and how that is it seems to me to be one of the goals of the law and of the regulators. But, you know, I notice a lot of these apps now, well, almost all of them have a review feature. They're all sort of Yelp-like now. In fact, every ride I take now, I have to, whether I want to or not, I have to review the driver. There's reviews on every place you might rent. I mean, do you view that as sufficient to satisfy that consumer protection goal?
So there are a few upsides of the rating system that you can't get in the traditional regulatory regime. So on some levels, it can bring improved customer service. On the other hand, there are still some issues with it, which is what about for the first few rides when there's not really enough information, or the last ride or service if the provider is thinking about getting off, they no longer have the incentive anymore. So I think there's some issues that are still present just conceptually in a rating system. And we saw that in the early days of eBay. They actually wouldn't really guarantee any transactions for the first five transactions online. So I think that's one open question. I think the other is just the value of rating systems themselves. We really want to make sure that they are truly working. And so the methodology of the rating system becomes very important. I think in a world of great inflation, it's unclear how many people are really thinking a lot about their rides. It often ends up being pretty binary. For anyone who's taken Uber or Lyft, you might just often do 5 stars, except if it's really bad, and then you might do something low. And I think that's often what tends to happen with a lot of review sites is you really get the extremes making reviews. So it's a little unclear on how well those systems work, and I think a lot of economists have done studies on some of that. But I think if done right, it can provide a 21st century way using transparency to help improve customer service and consumer protection.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that before we move on?
Actually, I want to say that is that I'm looking at the review system, and the review system, the way that I see it, is that as flawed as it might be, it is still better than to legislate this issue, because we not only have reviews, we have review of reviews. There are websites out there where you can say that company's reviews are biased or flawed, and the consumers, at last can make that decision. And whether or not some people doesn't even care. For example, if I'm taking a short ride in the middle of the day from my home to my work, do I really care if that guy is 1 star? I don't. It's up to the consumer to make that decision. I think there are enough information for the consumer to make a wise or at least fit decision for his own purposes or her own purposes.
Well, let me say, I think this is it's a really important issue, and there's 2 elements of it, and I'll be brief. One is that we need to be concerned about the barriers to entry that are created by the fact that the first movers here already have a bunch of reviews. Suppose I only want to use somebody that has 10 or more reviews. Nobody else can enter Airbnb. Nobody else could become an apartment sharing site because, and Justin said this before, there are no reviews, there's only 1 review, I'm not going to use it. So it actually prevents entry because it has this value of being a network economy. The other factor, though, that we should think about is the other day I was thinking it would be nice if we had something like Orbitz, but for ride sharing, because Orbitz will look at all the different hotels and will look at reviews and will tell you what the prices are. Well, maybe unsurprisingly, it turns out there is something like Orbitz for ride sharing. It's called Go A to B. And if you look at Go A to B and you put in your destination, it'll tell you all the ride-sharing companies that are available that are going from where you are to where you want to go, the price, the amount of waiting time. So there is a way of curating this. So as George said, there are reviews of reviewers. There are ways of curating this. And I think once that happens, the network economy problem will be less important.
I would just add one other thing on the rating perspective, which is it's probably about finding the right balance of those things we think should have a minimum threshold versus those where we want to allow some freedom and for innovation and transparency to take place. So, for example, we might feel that we don't need a lot of regulation around the type of car that someone is driving, but we might want regulation that a car driver should be background checked because the very high risk of someone having a severe criminal issue and then attacking a rider might be too great, such that we don't want to leave that up to transparency. I think you could imagine a world, and I'm not sure this is the best outcome, is where we just say anything can be rated, so we stop health inspections, so we stop any sort of basic standards and say we'll leave it up to the transparent rating market, and that probably seems perhaps a little too open without a safety net. So I think this is inevitably the balance of how do you make sure that consumers are protected but also given a lot of choice.
But compared to what? I worry that we don't do a very good job with taxi drivers either, if we stick to the Uber example. I have no way of saying this guy was aggressive, he yelled at other drivers, he went way too fast. There's really no way for me to register my dissatisfaction. I actually tried to complain about a taxi ride that I had in New York City. It's basically impossible. So Uber doesn't have to be perfect, they only have to be better with taxis, which often, frankly, suck.
Well, so I think you seem to be talking about this as a binary. You can do one or the other.
Well,
Uber
the background
does
check
background
is a good idea. The background check
Uber does
certainly
background
at
checks,
least.
right? So Uber wouldn't need to do background checks in a world where we say the consumer is welcome to choose among those, among anyone, those who do no background check and those who are, and it's up to the consumer to decide. I imagine one reason they probably don't do that is because you could probably get a cheaper ride without a background check. But there's like a lot of consumer confusion. They're trying to simplify the choice for the user. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do transparency, but there might be a certain set of basic things that you would want to ensure are in place for minimum safety standards.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. Let's move on a little. You know, one of the issues, we have some questions from the audience around an issue that I've come across in the literature, an argument that claims that the sharing economy cites this all the good that the good intentions started with, they're really just reproducing class, gender, and racial biases and hierarchy. And we have a question here. It is clear that the shared economy is beneficial for consumers, but how does it serve the underserved? For example, Uber doesn't have a service for indigent, or an Airbnb doesn't have a service to shelter the homeless. Any comments from our audiences? Well, I guess number one, does this economy help the, I guess, the underserved? And secondly, is this a proper, I guess, consideration or concern or policy goal as you know, as the law develops to encourage and enable this economy? Any comments about that?
Yes, I talked about earlier that in the old PUC model for telephones, the telephone companies receive the monopoly in exchange for serving underserved areas. They don't want to give them the cream, you know, or the crop, but they have to also serve the aside. One of the issues they talk about as a car sharing services that my company used to have is that what about disabled people, for example? They want to have mobility for that as well. Now, I think that is a policy issue that we need to have a discussion on, and whether or not we should require companies to provide that, or should we use some kind of taxation and then using that taxation to subsidize a service, for example, like Ready Wheels in the San Mateo County, that will serve people who are disabled, who need wheelchair. Not every car have a wheelchair ramp. So those are questions I think it's actually a good policy discussion or on a community discussion on see how those people can be better served.
I guess I'm of two minds about that question. On the one hand, as I said before, you need to recognize that some of the consumers that benefit from the availability of Uber are poor people that are trying to go to the doctor that otherwise would have to take 2 buses, and it would take a long time. Taxis are too expensive. On the other hand, there has been a problem in several cities, and we've seen this happen in Reykjavik, Iceland, London, and in Paris, where a lot of people have recognized that they can make more money by buying entire buildings and renting them out on Airbnb because they don't have to pay hotel taxes. So what the effect has been to reduce the amount of rental property that's available, and of course that mostly harms the people that are at the margin. They're not quite indigent, but these buildings are sold, they turn into co-ops, and they rent almost all the time on Airbnb. So this is an economically neutral tool like most revolutions. The reason my book is called Tomorrow 3.0 is both of those revolutions, the Neolithic and the Industrial, was extremely corrosive on institutions that until then had been used to take care of the poor and indigent. So we may actually face some really difficult problems that we can't foresee. The fact that if you live in New York, you can buy up an entire building of relatively low rent apartments, convert it and sell it all for Airbnb for $1,500 a night. that means that we're going to lose a lot of rental property.
Yeah, that is a problem, and of course, and the flip side of that is if you happen to be in the hotel business and you're competing with the Airbnb, you're probably a little concerned that they don't have the same compliance issues you might have that are for the protection of people who can't otherwise protect themselves, like ADA compliance and things like that. You know, from where I sit, I have to weigh in on this, even on the moderator, and I shouldn't. I have to, but from where I sit as a lawyer, during every economic downturn, I see people lose their jobs, their companies do big layoffs, they're looking for something to do, and I think the sharing economy in these apps has been just one of the greatest things, because it's an opportunity for no capital investment for people to go out on their own and do something and be able to earn an income and continue to support themselves, even when the economy might be in decline, or when their old economy business that they worked for all these years has gone under. So if we look at this as a social tool, I would say that this is an enabler of upward mobility, or at least of serving. And I know that's not exactly what the question was aimed at, but certainly I think we have to consider that, and that's really important, and that's why, just personally, I really like to see government policy enable and help these sort of things. Okay, well, thanks for that. So let's move on to, I guess, a couple of other areas. We've talked about where the law has changed. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the traditional legal issues that we see. I mean, just what I've been reading in the papers mostly about the problems that have come up. Misrepresentation, for example. Some of the ride-sharing sites have been sued for misrepresentation. San Francisco and Los Angeles have both sued Uber under existing consumer protection laws on misrepresentation grounds. There have been claims for neglect and fraud. There have been data access problems, data security breaches, for example. And of course, we haven't even gotten into contractor versus employee issues. But what I wonder about is do you think the traditional common law legal systems are sufficient to address these problems, or is there something different about the sharing economy that requires a regulatory overlay? For example, is misrepresentation of maybe a driver's background so important? I think you've convinced me that background checks are a good idea, just because the consequences of a misrepresentation would be really bad there. But is there something different about all the data they're collecting that requires an additional overlay? This is one that I know there's been a lot of discussion about, but I haven't seen any. Maybe I'm just not aware of any direct legislation. What do we think? Do we need new rules and a new regulatory system, or are sufficient rules good enough? Any comments?
I'll jump in on that one. So I think this may be a question not just about the sharing economy and regulation, but maybe where the economy more generally is heading. And so, we could explore whether the principles that we see here export elsewhere, which is, I think there is a general sense that, and as we all talked a little bit more earlier, that certain issues that technology platforms have, the use of transparency, the use of better understanding the services, might mean that less regulation is required in general. So I think everyone sort of feels like there is some disciplining force of having a rider or a driver rating, such that there is a reason that Uber and Lyft actually can provide you with sometimes a better riding experience than a taxi. And maybe that's because they know that they are working to stay above a certain rating to stay on the platform. And so that does have its own impact, which might mean that the government can look to take a step back on some of the regimes that it might have more heavily enforced before. But to your point about misrepresentation, that's only if we know that the things they say they're doing, they're actually doing. So maybe we need some way to regulators, if they're going to take the trust in changing that approach, need some way to audit or ensure that that's actually happening. There needs to probably be sort of a tit-for-tat strategy of considering changing approaches at the same time that the companies might share more of their data about what is actually happening. Are they actually sharing, covering certain areas of the city that they say they're going to, or are the ratings actually what they appear to be? So some sort of overlay would be needed if you're going to probably pull back on other areas.
So I've wondered about that, and Roger, you brought up the common law standard. I have wondered whether someone could succeed on a suit. Suppose I'm in Uber and a driver robs me, murders me, so I have a wrongful death action against them, and it turns out that this person had a history before of violence, but Uber said, well, we didn't know. But you have a negligence action because maybe they didn't know, but they should have known, because even a simple background check would have told them. Could you win under the common law and just saying, well, this is negligent? You could easily have checked, you failed to, you put me in danger. So I wonder how that's going to work out, and if we might use something like a common law standard. It's not strict liability, it's just everyday precautions. A standard background check would have told you this, you put me in danger.
Yeah, and I can find lots of lawyers that'll take that case. I guess the issue here that Justin has pointed out is, there's such a, I think he pointed out, that there's such an important societal interest in this that the government really does have to impose background checks because there are going to be, without it, there are going to be lapses. It's like, the first time, until somebody actually is violent, then they're not going to be reviewed as being a bad driver, right? So I can certainly see both sides of the issue. I like to think that the legal system can take care of these problems, but I'm realistic enough to know that it probably needs a little help. We're getting towards the end of the hour.
Sorry, can I just jump in on that point in terms of
well, I'll tell you what, George, why don't we use this as
okay.
your opportunity to kind of sum up your position, but why don't you go ahead, because we're getting towards the end and I'd like to wrap up on time.
Now, I want to sum up on this one. As a small business, small startup, I feel like that there is quite a lot of barrier of entry into the marketplace. One of the examples that I want to talk about, haven't had a chance, is that, for example, Uber and the LAX have an agreement to allow Uber to pick up people in LAX. But that agreement contingents upon Uber or any company like that to pay $25,000 a month to LAX. Now that is pretty easily a barrier of entry to smaller startups. So I want to caution to this side is that bigger companies that are in the established marketplace, they are trying to use laws to create barrier of entry to new competitors, new entrants to their markets. So when we talk about regulation, we need to keep in mind, just like what Michael says, what is the desired result? Are we regulating this to make sure that everybody's on the level playing field, or are we regulating this to protect either legacy businesses or the unions and whatnot? So in terms of hotels, so we want to make sure that when we write regulation, we need to be clear what are the objectives that we are trying to achieve, and be open and transparent about that as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Justin, any concluding remarks for us?
I think that this conversation just highlighted how complex the whole topic is and why everyone is searching for the best approach forward. I think we all would agree that these developments offer so much in the terms of upside for consumers that it is vital for us to figure out how to continue to deliver that, particularly given there's also an impact potentially on the environment, other issues with the idea of better using excess capacity, as Michael said. But I think we also highlighted that there are some intrinsic risks if we go too far, too fast without any sort of oversight, and there are some equal protection issues for those who were involved in the previous system. And so it is really needs to be a discussion with the startup community, with regulators, and consumers themselves to figure out what should be the new pathway forward to balance these underlying consumer protection principles while still unlocking the innovation to come. And I think that has to be a really focused dialogue in the coming months and years. And actually, our office will be hosting a discussion around this exact topic later in September, as we try and bring open-minded parties from both sides or all sides to figure out what this new regime needs to look like.
Okay, thanks very much. Michael, you get the last word here.
Well, and I talked too much already, so I just want to thank George and Justin and, of course, Royse University. I learned a lot from participating in this, and I'll look forward to hearing more about it in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the panelists being here to kick off our webinar series on the gig economy. This is the first, as I said, of a series. On September 13, Tuesday, same time, we will have our next presentation, The Future of the Innovation Economy. We will have a panel of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to discuss where they think the market is going, what the new opportunities are, what's hot, what's not. Wednesday, September 21, we are going to spend an hour talking tax issues around the innovation economy and some of the unique issues that have come up arising out of the new ways of doing business. And then finally, we'll conclude on October 19 with a webinar on employment issues, because those seem to be where we're having the most discussion and the most interesting issues and really the most uncertainty. So again, this webinar has been recorded. You can find it on royseuniversity.com. It's also available for download as a podcast in the iTunes store, and you'll find a recording on the Royse Law Firm YouTube site. Again, thank you, panelists, and thank you, attendees, for being here, and we will now conclude the webinar.